If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Deep woods campers and hikers, what chilling, scary encounter have you had with a creature or human out in the boonies? I was alone in a national park, very far from people, on a bright full moon night. Huge, clear moon, the kind of moonlight you can read by. The road went straight along the bottom of a wide, flat, mostly barren valley, then banked up and sharply left onto the ridge. It was about 10 p.m., and I drove through the valley on full alert, watching for animals and loving the scenery in the crazy bright moonlight. When I hit the curve and went into that sharp uphill left turn, I saw something through my side window. White thing. It was rapidly getting larger in my peripheral vision, as though it had been moving parallel to me, but the turn in the road meant I was now in its path. So I turned my head and looked directly. It was white. Man-shaped but without genitals, and naked. A deathly, nauseating white with a greasy shine, completely hairless. It was crawling on its hands and knees, but it was half the size of the car, and it was coming so very, very fast. It had a rubbery face, distorted by hate or a scream, and black eyes that reflected the moonlight. The look on its face, I can't even tell you, I can still make myself feel sick from the memory. I believed that it was intelligent and that it wanted to tear me apart with its teeth. The speed was horrifying. It went from being a small white spot to spitting distance in the time it took to make that turn. When I unfroze myself and hit the gas, it was on the road, and I braced for it to run into my car door. And then it was gone. The rearview mirror showed me nothing. I have never told anyone. I have seen a few minor glitches or ghostly things over the years, but nothing has ever frightened me like that. It was looking at me. And I don't know what it was. I can't seem to find any reference to anything like it, and I would like to know if this thing is known in folklore. I walk on train tracks near my property for walnuts, and at times I pucker up deer skeletons to make bone meal. One day this year, I was walking, and I got this heart-stopping fear that surged through me and stopped me in my tracks. I decided to stop to see what could have caused that sort of response. I didn't see it at first, but ahead of me, sitting next to the tracks, was an extremely thin but tall humanoid creature. It had its back partially towards me, but it was doing something with its arm. I stepped as quietly as possible off the tracks and into a drainage ditch so I could back out without being seen. When I did, I saw it was poking at a dead deer with sickeningly long fingers. I've no idea what it was, but I got the hell out of there. I've decided it was a hallucination, because if it wasn't, I'd be selling my home and moving far away. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and became acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. So I went to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I walked around a bend in the trail only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was not encountering anyone at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards away. Following bare precautions, I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. As I was packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, and so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than the food. Several days passed, and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that, in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise was much more likely an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees, and 100 miles from the nearest city plays tricks on your senses. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash at whatever opened it. But just like that, It was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence that something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail. Being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, "Duck this trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off I-5. The only problem was that it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got into my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night, the footsteps, the whispering, and the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sounds. I knew they were close, but I wasn't sure how close. All I could think was, this is ducked up, this is so ducked up. God damn it. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent, lights up the entire thing, and goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out, carrying my knife and yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them and the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terror that I experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple. My friend and I were geocaching, and after we found the cache, we decided to continue hiking in the area a bit. As we were hiking, we found the creepiest looking doll just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, staring in the direction we were coming from. We were at least a half mile away and in the opposite direction of the cache at this point. We're talking about one of those dolls that looks like a porcelain doll but has a plastic head. It had no clothes or hair. Just this old creepy doll sitting there. Needless to say, it creeped us the heck out. I wouldn't call it paranormal, but definitely scary or unnerving. I woke up with hundreds of boot prints in and around my campsite when I was solo camping near Rock Lake Solomon WPP. I heard nothing overnight, no cars, no people, but woke up with them all over the place. I skipped breakfast and just packed my site up as quickly as I could. I'm not sure if it was some hikers who decided to duck with me or some landowner who decided to play a trick on me, but it stuck with me for a while. For the amount of time I've been into hiking and backcountry camping, it seems like I've had a lot of unexplainable things happen to me, but I don't want to be so quick to characterize them as paranormal when there's most likely a rational explanation to them. But yeah, I have a fair number of them. I was walking in the mountains of Big Sur with 2 friends. It's a national park where there is almost no one. I think we were the only humans in a 5-kilometer radius. After setting up camp, we decided to climb to the top of a mountain to watch the sunset. The thing that you have to know is that when you watch the sunset until the sun is completely gone, it will be dark. Of course, stupid me didn't take a light, but luckily my 2 friends were smarter. We had a 3-kilometer hike to do back to our campground, and on the way back, one of my friends got really scared because she saw some eyes looking at us. I didn't see it, so I shrugged it off as her being scared of nothing. Then, not even 5 minutes later, me and the other friend saw the eyes as well. This was really scary since there are some wild animals living out there. We were especially afraid of the wild boar and cougars living out in those hills. After we saw the eyes, we decided to make more noise to hopefully scare them away. I was also holding 2 pretty useless stones, but it felt safer at least. We saw those eyes a couple more times on our way back to the camp. This was scary since they were following us. Once we arrived, we quickly made a fire and felt a lot safer. I was so tired that I just fell asleep quickly and had a wonderful night. Still a very scary experience. Something threw a rock at me. I was hunting in the early morning, maybe 15 minutes before sunrise. I was sitting on the side of a mountain or hill, and it was just starting to get light when a rock about the size of a basketball came hurling at me from below. It landed maybe 5 yards away from me, so it wasn't too close. I was mostly confused because I didn't hear anything when it was thrown. I just saw it arch up from under me and land beside me, with no explanation of how. Once it got to be about noon, I got up to leave and decided to try to throw it myself. It got like 5 feet away when I threw it downhill. It was way too heavy for a person to throw like that. I've never told this to anyone, but I have told others about similar instances involving pine cones. A rather large and dense one actually hit the back of my head, but I had a large scarf on, so I was very padded. Just another WTF, the angle of how this hit me makes no sense. Another scary thing is a bear's death moan. I watched one fall off a cliff next to camp and run off. Later that night, I felt like I was in a horror movie. Crazy demon tree story. Let me preface this by saying I am one of the most skeptical people you'll ever meet. I'm not religious, I don't believe in ghosts or aliens, in the come to earth /abduction /etc. sense. There's probably a good chance there's life out there somewhere in the vastness of space, or any of that. This is the weirdest thing I've ever encountered, and I have no real logical explanation for it. No drugs or alcohol were involved. My friends and I went camping up in the White Mountains of NH most summers in middle and high school, and a few years after, until life happened and we all went our ways. Being a bunch of unorganized teen boys and man-children, we always took forever to get in gear and actually get going, usually not leaving southern MA, where we lived, until late afternoon or early evening. One year we got up there about 10 p.m. or so and decided rather than hike into the woods, we'd just sort of camp or crash out in the parking lot and hike in the AM. After a bit of unwinding and some food, everyone went to bed except for me and one other dude. We ended up wandering over to a small wooden footbridge over a river. It was a perfectly clear night filled with stars and a fairly bright moon, and we were shooting the breeze for a good couple hours about all sorts of stuff, movies, games, life, etc. It had to be well after midnight by this point. As we were talking, we both got this creepy feeling of something being there, and it was sinister. Looking at the far end of the bridge, there was this massive, dead tree, no leaves, just clawing branches, silhouetted against the sky. We were both like, man, I swear the tree is creeping me out, but that's silly, right? At first we tried to dismiss it as silly, but both of us kept feeling more and more unnerved until I finally was like, screw this, I'm a grown man, I'm not afraid of a damn tree, I'm going to walk over there. I get like 2/3 RDS of the way across the bridge, and it feels like something reached in and grabbed my pounding heart. Just went totally ice cold. I backed up and was like, yeah, I'm afraid of a tree. I seriously think I'm not coming back if I go over there. We retreated from the bridge and decided to go to bed back in the sleeping bags by the car. The next morning, after breakfast, we decide to hike into the trail by going across that bridge. Halfway across, my friend freezes. Dude. I look across the bridge. It's a clearing. There are no trees there. I was told this story this past summer by someone I met running a campground up by Yellowstone and the Tetons. Private campground located in the greater Yellowstone region. Anyhow, I checked in and met the dude running the spot. He was really laid back and down to earth, and he even gave me updated accommodations, glamping instead of my campsite, for free. Anyhow, we connected pretty well. I felt comfortable around him and safe at his spot, which is important as I mostly travel solo. Well, we started chatting one morning, and he was telling me how he spent some time on the starting in Georgia and moving up north. I don't remember how it was brought up, but he begins telling me how one day he found a cut off the trail, an old carriage road or something, and that it was pretty quiet, not many hikers go off onto this portion, he claimed. Anyhow, he starts telling me how one day he's hiking and begins hearing branches and twigs breaking off the trail to his side. Being the only one there, he suspects an animal. According to him, he sets up camp that night and begins hearing the same noises around his campsite. Well, he begins to get sketched and decides he'll rest quickly and get back on the trail. The morning comes, and he hits the trail again and begins hearing the same noises. He begins telling me how he starts to get a little sketchy at this point. He seemed pretty legit, getting emotional and whatnot, not overly dramatic, but you could tell he was affected by recalling this. The dude tells me he starts picking up his pace on the trail, and the noises begin to keep pace with him. Finally, he reached a ranger station, which was closed. He says he was so freaked out that he was ready to break in when a ranger pulled up and saw him distraught. He starts explaining what is going on, and supposedly the ranger tells him he's surprised he made it that far by himself and lets him into the station. He gets inside, and the ranger shows him a storage area with around a dozen packs that he claimed to have picked up, with nobody around. Now the story gets weird, and I feel like the guy is full of poop, but again, he seems pretty emotional. He claims that while in the station, he and the ranger heard something on the roof, and he started mimicking the sounds this creature was making. Pretty much just really strange and obnoxious creature noises. He claims it was a Mothman or an alien. I have no clue what this dude was recalling or if he was full of poop. However, it sent me on a quest to see if anyone else has had a similar experience on this portion of the ad. That is all. Peace. I went on a scout camp when I was a kid, where we camped at the bottom of a cliff. We went on a big hike that ended at the top of the cliff, which we abseiled down. While I was waiting for my turn to abseil, I was watching the wheat fields that surrounded the hill. I noticed a man who appeared to be walking along on top of the wheat crop. Just sort of floating up there. My friend could see it too. We found our troopmates to show them, but by the time we did, the floating man was gone. To this day, I don't know if we saw something supernatural or just an optical illusion. Either way, it was very eerie. Let me first say that I have only told this to 3 people in my life for fear of being crazy. Almost 5 years ago, I was fishing at my grandma's pasture. She has several hundred acres in the south-central Kansas area. Where I was fishing, there is a small dam and waterfall in a fairly wooded area. It was just getting dark. I had walked the creek, and my vehicle was a good mile away. I was almost finished when I hooked a decent bass. I brought it in, and as I was throwing him back, something caught my eye across the creek. It stood only 4 feet tall at the max. It was gray, pale, and almost looked sickly. The best way I can describe it is like a hairless cat's head and skin, but with a skinny yet impressive human-like body. The creature was looking directly at me, like I ducked up and I shouldn't be seeing him. His head rocked side to side, almost like it was dancing. I slowly reached for my fillet knife, making sure not to take my eyes off it. I did feel threatened by whatever this was. I get my knife in hand, and it lets out a sound that I have never heard before and hope to never hear again. It was loud and extremely high-pitched, and it took off into the woods. I have never seen that again, but others have told me about the lights they see down there, but I didn't share my story for fear of ridicule. I now carry a gun with me when I fish. I'm a dude in his 20s from Pennsylvania who moved to Texas when I was 23. I made the move in January of 2018 via car, and some whack shit happened on the way down, in Mississippi. Given that I was young, well, I still am, I guess, and broke, I tried my best to find free campsites or Walmart parking lots for overnight stays. While traveling across Alabama and into Mississippi, I checked the internet and found a campsite available on something called the Natchez Trace Parkway. Thought, cool, let's go. So I'm driving on the NTP when a clearing opens up with a sign that says free campsites. I pull in and notice it's a small, circular campground. There was one other person there with a red truck, so naturally I found the campsite across the circle from him or her. You know, social distancing before social distancing was a thing. It's 4:30 in the afternoon. I eat dinner, play some guitar, and set up camp. When the sun fully set just before 8, I figured that it'd be a good time to smoke some weed and head to bed. I did just that. At 2 a.m., I woke up and felt confused. If you've ever camped alone in the winter before, you'll know what I mean. Senses heightened, cold sweats, nervous yet calm. But I shook it off and went back to sleep. I woke up again at 3:04 a.m., on the dot, but this time it was different. I was so ducking nervous, scared, and alone, in a much deeper sense than being away from my family. The forest had gone to sleep. The wind wasn't blowing, the birds weren't chirping, and the bugs weren't buzzing. If you're any kind of outdoorsman, then you'll understand that when the forest goes to sleep, something is out there. So I grabbed a hammer and a blowtorch, yay tent dabs, laid still on my back, and waited, trying not to breathe too loudly while my heart nearly beat out of my chest. Then I heard a crunch, a step, a foot, something ducking moved. Then, a second, a step, a foot, a third, a fourth, and the 13th followed by silence. Something was walking parallel to my dinky tent, and it took 13 very obvious and countable steps. The thing is, it wasn't coming at me or moving away from me, it was moving parallel to my tent. I lay there frozen, trying to remember how to breathe and be alive. But it was so hard since I was so scared, so far from home, so alone, and so weaponless. What to do? I thought. While contemplating, I heard another crunch, a step, and a foot. Holy shit, it's happening again. So I laid there and listened to the progression repeat itself. 1, 2, 3, 11, 12, and 13 steps parallel, not towards or away from, my tent. After the 13th step, I heard absolutely nothing for a while. The forest was dead silent. I had no ducking clue what to do, nor could I fall back asleep because, well, duck. That just happened. I remained motionless in my tent for another few hours until the sun rose above the horizon line, literally just enough light to allow me to pack my SHT and go. When that moment came, I James Bond rolled out of my tent with my hammer and blowtorch, ready to take on whatever the duck had bothered me all night. Once out, I stood up, did a quick 360, and looked around. Guys, there wasn't a ducking thing out there. The red truck was still there, but I could clearly see the person in their hammock. There were no footprints near me, no marks in the dirt, and my empty can of chili was still there. So I took a deep breath and threw my tent into my car. Yes, threw. I didn't pack it up. I didn't put it away. I ducking shoved it into my car along with my essentials and hightailed it out of there like you see in the movies where the car's wheels spin, kicking up a bunch of dirt. I got back on the Natchez Trace Parkway and ducking floated it to Louisiana. I felt such relief as I crossed the Mississippi River, knowing I was out of that state. I found a McDonald's, posted up with some food, and got my laptop out to do research on the Natchez Trace Parkway. It turns out it's the most haunted place in Mississippi. Ghost stories date back to the 1800s, when travelers were haunted by witches and ghosts. The Natchez Trace is also home to bloody wars fought between settlers and indigenous people centuries ago. So I like to assume I was haunted by a friendly, but terrifying, indigenous ghost. Also, I found a blog post once where another person who had camped mentioned the time being 3:04 a.m. because of unexplained events. Hence, I was so specific about that time earlier. Honestly, the craziest patch of woods I ever hiked was last night. Me and my children drove way out to a place called Old Mining City Road. It's a rural area inside a rural area, aka BFE anyway. I always bring a trash bag with me because, as Les Stroud says, no matter how remote the place, you can always find human garbage, and I like to do my part. But there was no trash. I picked up 2 cans by the road, but the woods were pristine. We found 12 arrowheads within an hour and literally encountered at least 20 deer sightings. I've never seen a more untouched piece of forest outside a national park. To boot, it was beautiful. We all very much felt watched. We heard a strange sound. We assumed it was a buck snorting, but it sounded kind of out of whack or off. It felt extremely sacred, and I made sure to leave it as I found it. This was in Australia. I was on a property we had been hunting on for at least 15 years, so I knew it really well. About 10:30 a.m., I was heading to an area where we had seen signs of feral pigs the day before. I had a .223 rifle with me, and it was a nice sunny day with a light breeze. I was walking up a small hill that had eucalyptus trees scattered on it and light scrub. The top of the hill had some granite boulders and rocks on it. I was about 50 meters from the top when I looked up and saw a large, hairy, humanoid face looking down at me. I froze and, without breaking eye contact, slowly started to unsling my rifle, not that I was going to shoot it, but if I was actually having an encounter with a Yowie, Australia's Bigfoot, I wanted to be able to get a warning shot if things went bad. Then the breeze caused the shadows from the trees to shift, and the face did one of those candlestick/two faces optical illusion things, and I realized it was a big eastern gray kangaroo. The lighting, the angle I was viewing it from, and the roo being behind the rocks, concealing it from about mid-chest down, had made my brain make a face. Wheeling between Moab and Monticello, Utah in the middle of the night, there was no moon yet and no clouds, so the stars were something lots of people never get to experience. I'm driving, and 2 friends are riding along. We crested a small sandy rise, and I hit the spotlight to catch sight of whatever night critters were about. At the edge of the spotlight, there was movement, just a dark form moving left to right, no way to tell exactly what it was. My buddy hops out with his rifle and stands with the truck door open, using the open window as a dead rest. He cranked up the scope and found the figure. It had stopped just inside the light and stood still. A friend says I think that's a man, so I got out and grabbed my binoculars and did the same, using the hood as a rest. The figure started moving again just as I found him. At first I thought it was upright, but when it started to move again, I wasn't so sure. I told him I thought it might be a bear. He whispered hold on, then said, it's definitely a person, he's looking at us and angling towards us. Now the figure is a couple hundred yards out but moving steadily closer. Discussion. Me, do you think it's someone lost? Buddy, maybe, but he'd be trying to get our attention, he's almost stalking. Me, I can't see him. Do you? Buddy, nope, I lost him in the shadows. Me, we're out. Friend in the back seat as we're driving away, duck, that was scary. Duck that guy. Indeed. In the 1980s, I believe, a very experienced Russian hiking group went on a multi-day trek through the Ural Mountains region of Russia. For them, it shouldn't have been a big problem at all. It should have just been a fun and easy hike and camping trip. This group was led by Igor Dyatlov, who was an extremely seasoned hiker. There were about 10 of these hikers on the trip. After not hearing of the hikers' return, people who knew of this trip began to become concerned. They reported the group missing to the local police. This spurred a search that would result in the finding of the bodies of every member of the group. The thing that was strange, though, was the condition of the bodies. A few were dead inside their tent, I think around 2 to 3 of them, and evidence showed that the tent had been slashed and ripped from the inside, almost like the campers were trying to escape from something. They soon found the bodies of the rest of the group that were scattered further away from the tent, about 6 of whom had died of hypothermia due to the extremely cold temperatures. The rest had died of physical trauma. Some of them were missing eyes, teeth, and tongues, and a few even had their chests and skulls caved in. A few of the bodies even displayed abnormal amounts of radiation. There was no evidence of an animal attack other than the missing eyes and tongues. Even if it were an animal attack, there were so many hikers there that night that at least a few of them, armed with pocket knives, would have likely tried to attack it, which there was no evidence for. There are still no completely agreeable theories about what happened that night, even 30 to 40 years later. Lived in the forest. Baboons would come by and wreck our plants every few weeks. One day I was at home when an alpha came up to our granadillas, passion fruit, and started munching. None of them were ripe, so he'd take one bite out of one, then throw it aside and go for the next one. I went outside to chase him. He ran 2 steps, then turned around and looked at me, like, I'm twice your size, human. What are you going to do? I froze. This baboon was huge. I went inside, locked the doors, and found some firecrackers. That did the job. They don't like gun sounds, as there are farms in our area. I was pretty frightened when he was up on his haunches, staring at me, and I realized that he could probably kill me with little effort. When I was about 14 years old, my friends and I would carry a bunch of gear to a camp spot we found on the lake that was maybe half a mile from my friend's house. One night, I woke up to rocks hitting the tent. The rocks were pretty big, some close to golf ball size. They also seemed to be coming from multiple directions. Me and my friends just huddled in the tent. One of my friends wanted to rush out, but we wouldn't let him. After several minutes of rocks hitting the tent, the rocks stopped. A few minutes later, we heard what sounded like a woman scream a few hundred yards down the beach. The next morning, my friend found his fishing pole on the ground near the tent, broken in 2 places. To us, this ruled out a friendly prank. If it was friends of ours, they wouldn't purposefully break our fishing poles. It also indicated that whoever it was had walked around the camp before throwing rocks at our tent. Amazingly, that wasn't the last time we camped there. When I was a kid, my cousin, myself, and my brother used to take off all the time. We were the ones that weren't older teens, so we weren't really cool. I was 13, and my brother and cousin were both 10. We put our bikes in the woods, took a path, then ended up off the trail. There were 2 men pulling a big black duffel bag. We were up high on a hill, so they couldn't really see us. They had shovels. We watched, pretending to be spies. Sharing the binoculars. When they looked in our way, we ran. We ran back to the bikes, then rode back to camp as fast as possible. At that time, we camped with about 15 other families. Travel trailer camping group, no one at all believed us. We begged them to call the police. No one believed us. We still tell our family now that they should have listened to us. I'm now 35, and my brother and cousin are 32. To this day, no one believes us. When I was in 6th grade, the whole population of 6th graders got to go to a local forest and camp out for about 3 days. One of the nights we had a campfire where we roasted marshmallows. Apparently every single teacher forgot their flashlights, and apparently they didn't have smartphones either, so they sent me to go get them from the teacher's cabin. It was pitch black, and I started to slowly walk in the direction of the cabin. It had a faint light source, like a single lantern. Suddenly I hear footsteps coming from behind me, then a voice. They told me to come with you. Now, mind you, I couldn't see anything, but it sounded like a child's voice, so I didn't think anything of it. We started walking to the cabin in complete silence, only our footsteps being heard. Then I saw the cabin light and started running towards it, wanting to get back to the campfire ASAP. I got inside the cabin and realized the person was not in there with me. I grabbed the flashlights and walked back into the now semi-bright outside. No one was with me. I still, to this day, don't know if that person was real or not. I'm not camping, but my house is situated in a fairly wooded area. When I was 13, I had just come home from school. There was a big storm outside, and rain was pouring down. It was around 3 or 4 p.m., and it was still pretty bright out despite the storm clouds. I was making myself a sandwich when a bolt of lightning struck the ground about half a block away from my house. The boom was loud, but immediately following the boom was a human-like screech that gave me shivers. I looked out the window through the rain and could see some kind of animal crawl from the woods to a jeep that was nearby. I thought, oh crap, a dog must have gotten hit by that bolt. I went up to the window to get a closer look and saw a big orange-red furry thing crawl under the car. It looked like an orangutan. Seriously, it was big and moved like an ape. I saw its arm grasping the side of the jeep as it crawled under. I took a minute to think about what I just saw and then decided to go try to get a closer look. So I went outside and slowly walked up to the jeep. When I got to the jeep, I looked under and saw a glimpse of something orange disappear into a storm drain that the jeep was parked next to. I noped the duck out of there. I still have no clue what it was. It screeched like a dying coyote but looked like a giant orangutan. Sewer apes. My friend worked at a Harrah's casino in Maricopa, Arizona. Anyone familiar with the area knows that this particular casino is out in the middle of nowhere on the Native American reservation. Anyway, my friend is a normal, emotionally stable white guy who is atheist. He was working late around 3 a.m. on the casino floor. He is a night owl, so he was wide awake since this is his normal shift. He is not a drug addict or one to make up bullshit stories. So here he is in this empty casino walking into the vacant men's bathroom on the opposite side of the casino floor. He walks in, does his business in the urinal and turns around to go wash his hands when he notices someone standing at the sink staring into the mirror. He thinks to himself, that's strange, I didn't even hear anybody walk in. He gets closer to a sink about 5 rows down and begins washing his hands. He glances over again to realize it was not a man that was standing at the sink but a woman in a red dress. Right when he is about to say something about her using the wrong restroom, this woman turns her head slowly towards him and he just stares at her kind of in disbelief, thinking this chick must be drunk or blind to not realize she was in the men's bathroom. As her head slowly turns, her eyes were a dark glowing red. He describes it as the red eye you would get when taking a photo of someone. He freaks out, doesn't know what the duck is happening and looks down to notice she doesn't have any legs. Instead she has what he described as the bottom half of a deer for legs and she was walking on hooves. Anyway, as this thing turns towards him it starts to move aggressively and my friend ran out of the bathroom obviously scared shitless. He had his buddy review the surveillance tape of that area around the bathroom, but all that was seen was him going into the bathroom then him running out of the bathroom. He may have experienced this. So, it was a group of guys. We went way back into the woods and walked for nearly an hour in deep Appalachian terrain. Lots of slick red clay. Lots of mosquitoes. We got to the spot and started setting up. Right next to a bend in the creek. We cooked, ate, and made stupid jokes, then we made a big fire and waited for night. Finally, night came. Conversation was calming, but no one was ready to bed down. Then I heard it. Off in the dark, the sound of 2 small girls giggling. I thought I had absolutely lost my mind. It kept repeating at uneven intervals. Even more worrisome, it kept bouncing from place to place in the woods. I resolved to say nothing and live in my insanity for the night. I was leaning up against a tree and holding my machete close, not that it would help. I was starting to spiral when my friend said, "Okay, is no one else hearing that?" I immediately asked him what he was hearing. He says, "It sounds like 2 little girls laughing in the woods." I've never been more freaked out and happy at the same time. All of us, but one that was trying to be the cool guy, went into a frenzy talking about hearing the same thing but not wanting to sound crazy. We went out into the woods but found nothing. We decided to bed down around 3 a.m. 7 dudes in a giant tent, not exactly ideal. We continued hearing the laughter, and each one of us slowly traded conversation for unconsciousness. I was the last to fall asleep. I could barely cover my eyes until dawn. Daybreak is slow when you're under that much canopy and brush. We were all up and stirring a few hours later. We packed up, talked about the night, and went home for a good shower and a nap. I tried to go back a few years later, but someone had bought the land and blocked it all off. Strange trails. To this day, I can't find anything similar. This happened about a decade ago, when I was a teenager. My family and I moved onto a country property that had a small acreage paddock on the side of the house, bordering dense bush or forest. No other houses were nearby. Anyway, I would go out at around 9-ish, dark, in the evening to give my horse a last feed, pat and brush him, check that he wasn't cold, etc. He was the first horse I ever had, so I was really fond of hanging out with him. Anyway, for 2 nights in a row, this owl just suddenly turned up and would be sitting on the clothesline really close to where I would stand with the horse. It would just stare intensely at me the whole time and not fly off, even though I would be literally within inches of it. Not even the huge sensor spotlight on the driveway nearby would freak it out enough to fly off when it would come on and light up the whole house and paddock periodically, depending on where we moved around in that spot. I thought it was peculiar with the owl, but that was about it until now, in hindsight. Anyway, on the 3rd night, it was there again but did eventually fly off halfway through me feeding the horse. I stood there stroking my horse in the glow of the faint interior garage light for about 10 minutes, just taking in the night, when my mom came out from behind me, where the garage side doorway was, to see how I was doing, etc. As we started talking, her 3 chihuahuas and my bull terrier ran out into the middle of the paddock for a sniff. As they ran past the first paddock fence, they set off the sensor spotlight. We kept talking for about a minute when my mom, being slightly elevated above me, and the horse in the garage looked puzzled over the horse towards the back of the paddock, saying, "What is that?" The paddock, towards the back, became incredibly steep, with our water tank sitting on the high side as it descended down to the other side of the paddock, bush, and road. I must add that all my animals, the horse and the dogs, were very sensitive to movement, especially strangers. If the dogs saw anything suddenly start moving fast out of nowhere, they would definitely chase it and bark at it aggressively. Anyway, I stepped out in front of my horse with my mom and moved towards the fence to see a white figure hunched over beside the water tank as if sussing out the water that had overflowed. At first, from the position it was in, I thought it might be a large kangaroo, from Australia, but as me and my mom leaned on the fence to get a closer look with the light shining brightly, it suddenly turned its face over its shoulder and looked at us, realizing we were watching it. We realized in that second that it was a humanish face, but were both frozen in shock at what it possibly was. Next it suddenly turned around and went from being this maybe hunched over animal to a giant slender figure, taller than the water tank, 7 feet-ish, shaped like a humanoid or man with a long face, mouth, and eyes, white all over, no hair, and long arms. However, what was really odd was that it was wearing a baggy, huge white t-shirt that hung past its waist. No other clothing. It stared at us for a second, standing straight up, then quickly hunched over low to the ground again and started running down the steep hill across the borderline of the paddock and bush, just like on all fours down the hill, except instead of its hands touching the ground, they just went side to side like someone normally running or walking. Even though it was hunched over, its back was dead straight at that angle, and its neck and head kept smoothly turning over its shoulder, looking at us as it ran as fast as possible. Even as it disappeared into the bushes, even though you couldn't see it, you could still hear it smashing through the bushes. All the while, our dogs didn't bark or acknowledge anything had happened, even though the thing ran right in front of them. Neither did the horse budge to the loud smashing noises of it in the bush. Me and my mom, suffice it to say, bolted back into the houses, freaked out at what we had seen. After that, I stopped hanging out at night alone with the horse. The main things that still get to me the most about that sighting are the out-of-place t-shirt, how it ran so fast at such an impossible angle against gravity while managing to twist its head at us, and the dogs ignoring it. Not in the woods, literally, but last summer one of my friends shared a creepy story around the campfire. Here it goes. In my grandmother's house, there was always an unsettling feeling of aggression and fear, like a malicious presence that would follow you. It was strongest at night. Me being a night owl, I would usually be awake and alone wandering around while everyone else was fast asleep. I liked to comfort eat at night to help myself get sleepy. A full tummy usually made me feel less anxious. When I would walk into the kitchen to get food, it always felt really cold. My bare feet would ache from the freezing tiles. There were glass sliding doors facing out to the back garden. Beyond them was just blackness. I always feared looking out into the black in case I would see something looking in. 3 years before, when I was 6, my grandfather died in that kitchen, choking on his own vomit while everyone was asleep upstairs. He had come home after a heavy drinking session and fell asleep sitting upright in his chair. He vomited and did not wake up, so he slowly choked to death. My dad found him the next morning, pale and cold. He tried CPR but to no avail. He just caused the vomit to spill on himself while he screamed and woke up the whole house, calling for help. It always felt cold in that house after that, especially the kitchen. My grandmother couldn't sleep in their room after he died. She said there were too many memories and that she had too many bad dreams of him calling to her in a gurgling voice. She found it too disturbing, so she moved into the spare room, and my 2 aunts took her room. I would sleep in between them at night. Directly above the bed was a square hatch that led to the attic. At night, both my aunts would be asleep, and I would lie awake. My anxiety issues made it difficult for me to drift off. While my aunt slept, I would listen to the house settle, rattling pipes, creaking wood, and from time to time this light scratching sound at the attic door. It used to really creep me out. It's nothing I used to tell myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling it sounded almost deliberate. It happened semi-regularly, so after a while I began to accept that it was just a sound the house made. One night in bed, my Aunt Nikki and I were talking about Granddad. We wondered if he was watching over us or if he was in heaven. She began to drift off when the scratching started. It was louder than usual, more deliberate. I was scared. I nudged Nikki to wake her. She was already awake. She turned over and faced me. "Nikki, the scratches are scaring me." She looked me dead in the eye. "Don't talk about it, go to sleep, ignore it." I lay there for hours. The scratching never stopped. I must have drifted off eventually, as the next thing I knew, it was morning. After that night, I was annoyed that my aunt ignored my fears, so I stopped sleeping in that room and preferred the living room couch instead. I'm in my 20s now. Years later, I asked my aunt why she would ignore me about the attic and why she always told me to be quiet when I pointed it out. She told me this. I wasn't being dismissive. We didn't talk about the scratching for a reason. If you talk about it when it's happening, it gets worse. We stopped talking about Granddad in that room too. It always got louder when we did. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw, which is basically a giant machine that is capable of cutting down massive trees and cutting them to specified length. Which means he spends a lot of time alone in the deep forests. So my dad used to work 16 to 20-hour days constantly to get done as quick as possible, and then the rest of the crew would come clean up the trees and ship them to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone and the rest of the time with another tree saw operator named Renee. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. This is relevant down the line. My dad and Renee were put on a new job site and were about 10 days in and everything was going as planned. But they were constantly hearing weird chitter-chatter over the radio that was such poor quality no words could be heard, and whatever radio channel they changed to, it followed them. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They come to the realization that they are in a very secluded area with people who shouldn't be there, and the worst part is that they aren't scheduled to leave for about another week. They would only leave to refuel the fuel truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Renee comes across a tent and calls my dad over. They investigate the tent and find one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. They investigate the duffel bag and find many pairs of underwear and things that appear to be kit, like rope, duct tape, and weird photographs. In the tent, they also find a small amount of food, which includes canned goods and an apple, which proves the tent has been occupied recently because there was no mold on the apple. They are now on the mountain alone, which, in the best case scenario, is just a really ducked up individual. They decide that they will not talk over the radio except in cases of emergency and see if they can hear something over the radio. They are now within close enough range of whoever has been talking over the radio to hear the conversations between two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. At the end of the workday, my dad hears them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hops on the radio and attempts to communicate with them about what the duck they are doing. I believe he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" After this, the conversation between the men abruptly stops, and they never pick up. That night, Renee wakes my dad up and whispers for him to get his gun from someone outside. My dad has told me that the first thing he hears when he wakes up is the quiet shuffling of footsteps. My dad fumbles for his gun and finds it, but realizes that he ducking doesn't have it loaded and has little clue where his rounds are, and Renee has nothing, and the thought of calling the police is absurd for multiple reasons. They hear a jiggle on the doorknob, and it opens. The camper is far enough off the ground that you have to jump in, and there is no ladder or footstool. It just stays open, and neither my dad nor Renee move. They hear scratching right outside the door, though. After 4 minutes of scratching, my dad can no longer take it and nods at Renee. He gets up quietly and walks towards the camper door, and the second he reaches it, he is met with intense pain across his right eye all the way to his left cheek. He has been cut and falls out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife gets on top of him, and he is soon kicked in the top of the head by a man behind him. Renee leaps out of the trailer and manages to get the man off my dad, and my dad gets up and realizes that the second man without the knife is running away, and the man with the knife is scrambling away from Renee and starts running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Renee get into the truck and drive to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs, and 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found murdered and thrown into a ditch. No one has ever been convicted of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and the pupil is disfigured and looks more like a cat's eye than a human's. I have a fairly recent one. One of my favorite places to hike is on land originally inhabited by Native Americans. The park itself encircles a pretty old cemetery with lots of Civil War-era graves. I'm a fan of pre-dawn hikes because I like to watch the sun come up, and that's when the wildlife is most active, so a couple of weeks ago I took my dog there on my day off at around 6:30 in the morning. We strolled through the cemetery and then headed into the woods. I didn't see a single other person, which is normal there. It's rural and not a super well-known place, and again, it was early. We were fairly deep into the woods when my dog stopped and pointed behind us. I didn't see or hear anyone, but it's a winding trail, and it was possible it was a critter she could see or smell and I couldn't. We continued on. She stopped again. Repeat several times. I finally see a person on the trail, pretty far back but coming up on us fast. They weren't jogging, they were just moving quickly. I picked up my pace a bit, but they kept gaining. My dog was getting more and more agitated, so I decided to step off the trail to let them pass. As they got closer, I saw that they appeared to be wearing some sort of mask under a pulled-up hood. Not like a surgical mask, but maybe a balaclava? It wasn't cold enough for that, but I don't know, some people are super scared of COVID, right? And then they got closer, and I realized it wasn't a mask. This person had no face. No eyes, no features of any kind. Just a black, empty void. My dog, who had been spazzing until then, didn't make a sound. She just stared. I stared. The person stared at us, the head swiveled towards us. And then they passed and were gone. I took a deer trail as a shortcut and hightailed it right the duck home. I've been back there since and haven't seen anything like that again, but I've also decided not to cut through the cemetery before sunup anymore. I'm a 33-year-old woman from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, after planning for 5 years, turned 30 and sold everything we owned, even my car. We set off in his Trailblazer, leaving behind all comforts to travel through the United States and Canada. Some might label us as backpackers, as we chase pleasant weather, discover state parks, and venture deep into the wilderness for days. My brother humorously dubs us anti-establishment hippies. Last summer, we decided to explore the backcountry in Arkansas. A state not commonly mentioned by hikers, but rumored to possess stunning natural beauty, which it does. The rules at the park were lax, no permit required, just a few basic guidelines. We carried all we needed for a 6-day hike, 3 days in, 3 out. Throughout our journey, solitude was our companion. However, on the first day, nearing twilight, we sought a camping spot half a mile off the trail, our standard practice. By chance, we followed what appeared to be an animal trail and stumbled upon a green, 2-person tent, almost hidden among the foliage. We're the sociable sort, having positive experiences camping near fellow backpackers and sharing tales, food, and maybe a joint. Standing around 30 yards from the tent, my boyfriend called out a greeting, but there was no response. Assuming the occupant desired privacy, we headed in a different direction. We pitched camp, oblivious to the presence of green tent guy. We resumed our journey the next day, putting the thought of the tent aside until day 5, on our return. Seeking a camping spot again, we encountered the green tent. Unusual but not unheard of, most backcountry hikers keep moving. This time, the tent flap was open. My boyfriend shouted a greeting, but silence prevailed. He proposed investigating, mentioning the possibility of someone being hurt. I was uneasy. Though we hadn't encountered trouble before, we'd heard stories from other hikers about reclusive hermits and armed mountain men. My boyfriend reassured me, suggesting we offer weed if things got tense. Within 20 yards, a putrid smell engulfed us. My boyfriend, still shouting greetings, halted. His fearful words broke the silence. What if we find a dead body? Dread gripped me, and fear took over. I'd never seen a corpse and had no wish to. Approaching the tent, the stench intensified. I was certain we would confront a decaying body. But reality proved worse. Outside lay the severed legs of a doe, swarmed by flies. The legs appeared to have been hacked and then torn off. Inside, the deer's body and head rested, swathed in a blood-soaked blue blanket. Its posture, the cut tail, and the twisted form all horrified us. The tent revealed this gruesome scene. We didn't need to enter. The odor was unbearable. A nearly empty bottle of baby oil and a stained towel were the only objects present. Tears flowed as I begged to leave. My boyfriend managed, "What the hell?" Terrified, we fled. Running until dark, we set up camp, avoiding light and sound. We whispered, replaying the chilling sight. Every noise sent us into alarm. We anticipated the tent's owner returning, tracing us, a wave of terror surging through us. At dawn, we fled. Reporting our encounter at the ranger station, the young ranger mirrored our shock. We shared our story, indicating the tent's location. He inquired about the deer's cause of death, a detail we hadn't pondered. Now, our backcountry hikes span a maximum of 4 days. We're cautious around tents without occupants. The nightmarish image still haunts us, forever etched in our minds. My fiancée and I hiked into some forest in Ontario. We had a friend drop us off at the side of an old logging road in the middle of nowhere, and we hiked into the woods due east. The road ran north-south, so basically all we had to do was stay due east hiking in and due west hiking out, and we would reach the road again for our rendezvous at a predetermined time a couple of days later. There are no natural predators this far south, such as bears or wolves, so for protection, I only brought a K-bar knife and some bear spray, in case coyotes took an interest in our 2 dogs that accompanied us. The logging road was no longer in use by any industry, and we had hiked into the woods for a few kilometers, so the chances of running into another human were nil. In addition, hunting is not permitted in the area, and there is no water nearby for fishing. There really wasn't any reason for anyone else to be out there in the middle of the woods that far off the road. No cell service, although I did bring a flare gun and multiple flares in case we ran into trouble to signal for help. No GPS, just a compass. We were careful hiking in and didn't do anything risky to avoid injuries in this remote place. It was early fall, but it was unseasonably cold. Well below freezing. There are lots of leaves on the ground and still on the trees, but no snow yet. We set up camp in some thick woods. You could barely see 50 feet away because the trees and bushes were so dense. We were totally isolated and felt completely safe. It was so cold and so dark at night, it was moonless and cloudy, that we went to bed early to stay warm. I'm a heavy sleeper, and the next thing I know, I'm awakened by my dog pawing at my face. It is pitch black, and I can't even see him. I go to pet him, but something is wrong. As I touched him, I could feel his fur standing straight up, and he was completely rigid, facing the door of the tent. He was clearly on guard and very alert. At first, I assumed there was a woodland creature nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That is unusual, because I often camp alone without a problem and am not easily spooked. My dog and I just stayed there, frozen and alert, for at least a couple of minutes. My fiancé and another dog were still asleep next to us. It was 3:30 a.m., I checked my phone after the incident. The fire was out. No moon. Complete blackness. Just as I was letting my guard down, I heard the most unexpected thing, a notification going off on a phone just outside of our tent, maybe 15 to 20 feet away, and I saw a faint glow. I hear a male voice mutter "Oh duck," or something to that effect, and I hear them running through the leaves away from our tent. They were clearly smacking into tree branches, etc., and swearing as they did so. At this point, they turn on their flashlight as they run, and I can see the beam flailing wildly around in the woods, occasionally back onto our tent. The dogs start going ballistic, and I grab my knife and look at my phone. It's 3:30 a.m. I screamed out, "If you come back here, I'll blow your ducking head off." I'm assuming he had a satellite phone or really good cell service to get a notification like that. The other weird thing was that he fled deeper into the woods and nothingness, not west towards the logging road. Needless to say, we packed up in the cold and hiked back to the road, watching our backs the entire time. We just walked down the road towards far-off civilization until we ran into some other campers set up right next to the road, 7 or 8 kilometers away from where we came out of the woods. It was just after first light, they let us use their satellite phone, and we called our friend to come pick us up a day early. Upon hearing our story, the campers decided they would pack up as well and get out of the area. Lesson learned. I do not camp in the wilderness anymore without a satellite phone and a 12 gauge.